Welcome. I'm Tita Chico, Professor of English and Faculty Director of the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies at the University of Maryland. We convene this year-long series on anti-racism to act on the various statements of solidarity for Black Lives Matter, issued by the university, the college, and the department. We also convene this series to honor and highlight the long-standing commitment among many English department students and faculty to anti-racist scholarship and teaching. To be clear, anti-racism is not an add-on in this series. It is the intellectual starting point for humanistic literary inquiry. Anti-racism is a practice that leaves behind the platitudes of diversity and inclusion. As my colleague, Professor Zita C. Nunez writes, this is the time for remaking, for asking who we are. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Black Lives Matter. Jacob Blake, Daniel Prude, Black Lives Matter. We're meeting virtually today, but we are grounded by our institutional home, the University of Maryland. With this series, we honor and celebrate the memory of Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III, a young Black man who was about to graduate from Bowie State University in May 2017, when he was murdered by a white supremacist at a campus bus stop. Black Lives Matter. Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III. We're meeting virtually today, but we are also grounded by the sedimented lands upon which the university stands. The grounds of the university are on what is now known as the state of Maryland, adjacent to the District of Columbia, the seat of the US federal government. But these grounds are the original homelands of the Anacostan and Piscataway tribal nations. The University of Maryland is dotted with buildings that name, but in naming also forget this Indigenous history. The home of the English department for 20 years, Susquehanna Hall. Susquehanna comes from the Lenape for Oyster River. Also on campus, a dorm, Queen Anne's Hall. Yes, that Queen Anne, the 18th century Queen Anne, the period in which large-scale settler colonialism and genocide devastated these tribal nations. And Washington, D.C. It is home to a football team named until very recently with a racial slur. For the Indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we gather, to evoke the phrasing of my colleague, Professor Gina Zorowski, the long 18th century has never ended. Yet, how might anti-racism enable us to understand the long 18th century that has never ended, but understand it better and understand it more justly? Robin Wall Kimmerer, she's a botanist and a member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation. Kimmerer, she gives us a way to think through, to think by thinking through the plant sweetgrass. Sweetgrass, she writes, is passed from hand to earth to hand across years and generations. Sweetgrass, she tells us, thrives along disturbed edges. Today, we are very honored to think across years, to think across generations, and to think along those disturbed edges with our guests, Bakary, Diaby, and Kristina Huang, for their conversation, citational practices, and new directions in the long 18th century.
Thank you.
As Professor Catherine McKittrick asks in her newly published and shatteringly brilliant meditation on Black feminisms, Dear Science and Other Stories, she asks, what if citations offer advice? What if citations are suggestions for living differently? What if some citations counsel how to refuse what we think they are? The Center's Anti-Racism series is co-sponsored by the University Libraries and the Graduate School's Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Today's event is also sponsored by the Stringer Foundation and by the Long 18th Lecture Series. With this support, we're able to commit to making these events accessible, and you'll find the link for live captioning. I want to thank the Center's graduate assistants, Danielle Griffin and Liam Daly, and as always, a very special thank you to the co-director, Dr. Karen Nelson. Our program will be an hour. Our guests will be in conversation for about 30 minutes, after which I'll come back to moderate the Q&A. So now that I please ask you to join me in welcoming Professors Diaby and Huang for citational practices in new directions in the long 18th century.
Before I start, I want to thank the University of Maryland's Center for Literary and Comparative Studies for the invitation, for hosting. Specifically, thank you, Tita, Chico, Karen Nelson, Danielle Griffin, and Liam Daly for their work of organizing. And I thought it was very interesting that you started with the Catherine McKittrick quote, Tita, because I was on Twitter last night and I was like, what's going on? And I happened to have this book on my table. So I read it this morning as a way to think alongside with you as well. And I found what I think would be a nice epigraph for our conversation, specifically the conversation I'm about to have with Bakary. And this is on page 34 of Catherine McKittrick's story around footnotes. So, referencing is hard. We share our lessons of unknowing ourselves and in this refuse what they want us to be. We risk reading what we cannot bear and what we love too much, and then we let it go, revise, and read it again. So I think this kind of captures what it's been like to have this conversation, what I perceive to be like a 6-month conversation with Bakary and his work. We've been meeting, Zooming, and it's just been really wonderful. So the last conversation we had, we ended on this idea of citations as a groundwork for another kind of conversation. And so I hope today you can see, Bakary, that this is really like a thank you as well. A thank you for letting me, I don't know, think alongside with you. So a note to the audience, I'm going to be dropping links throughout the chat, throughout the presentation. And I'm going to just share some ideas that I was able to have through Bakary's work. And I'll give like a bit of a summary for his 2 most recent essays, and then I'll pivot into questions. So Bakary, in your essay, Feeling Black, Feeling Back, Fragility and Romanticism, you outline a historical atmosphere of anti-Blackness through romantic representations, specifically literary representations of white fragility, vulnerability, and discomfort. And the essay turns specifically to literary representations of childhood, innocence, and revolts, revolts that were organized by enslaved peoples to illustrate the gendered racial assumptions of pain in the body. So what I see your work doing is you're turning to Romanticism as a mode of historical analysis that can privilege white interiority and feeling. And your essay points to whiteness as a political project that is made and unmade through affective experiences with romantic art. So you draw on the work of Thomas Fowle, Sharon Holland, Kristina Sharp, to examine this historical atmosphere, this historical atmosphere of Romanticism. And you also turn to contemporary works of people who have a public presence, specifically Brittany Cooper, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Robin DiAngelo. So I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about romantic literary criticism, why you're bridging romantic literary criticism with contemporary writings that have wider public appeal.
Sure, thanks, Kristina. It's been my pleasure as well. First of all, that's a very generous, I think, very generous précis of the article. And I think, well, I should say first, an earlier version of that article really started with D'Angelo's 2011 article, and so um, the success of the book, I think, really just told me that there was a there, and really really insisted that we should um, uh, expand the idea of fragility beyond the interpersonal, as D'Angelo focuses on. I think for me, methodologically, I have a set of questions, and each of those questions raises problems, and I just look for ways to solve those problems. So I'm very much interested in particularly how art objects can solve those problems. And I think I'm interested in public facing work that tries to be, and I go to public facing work to try to solve these problems in part because it's public facing, it's accessible. And as D'Angelo's 2018 book became a bestseller, it tells me that people are interested in this issue. We could think about why, and the sort of, perhaps for some, the sort of the sort of ocular nature of that interest, but people are interested. So I look at sort of public works that are, I think, simultaneously critical and accessible. I should also say, for me, even romanticism. I mean, you brought up the question of how I sort of might stray from romantic criticism. In one of our conversations, you said that romanticism almost seems besides the point in some of my essays, and that's totally understandable. I think even romanticism is like a question that has been posed to me, or a problem that someone has raised for me to not necessarily solve, but to sort of grapple with. And it's not really a field or a sort of static target of my analysis. And so it allows romanticism itself to be this aesthetic that I just like, and I can shape it into a tool to help me answer those questions and solve those problems. I don't actually know what my field would be, but I think this is true for all of us. I just have a lot of interests that I find are somehow connected through me, and therefore must be connected somehow through my research. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I found, I found it really wonderful to have a moment and reflect on specifically Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility book, just because, as we are all like driven into our little spaces, there was just this like amplification of like white fragility, of what is whiteness. And you know I because there was all this social media talk about whiteness and white fragility, I really wanted to think more about it. And I think that uh how might the ways that people are talking about whiteness actually obscure, or there's some sort of uh, algorithm that is like that is trying to work itself out in this particular moment. And so one of the things that I was thinking about, I actually attribute your work in helping me think about the social practices and the ways that images and the language of racialization circulates, and to think about race as an algorithm or a formula to like resolve a crisis. I can say more about that a little bit later, but I just want to go back to your point about turning to artwork and turning to your point about artwork as a way to think through romanticism. And so could you say a little bit more about, I think Claudia Rankine has a very special place in your thinking. So
Yeah.
you actually cite her in both of your most recent articles. You write that Claudia Rankine's 2014 Citizen, an American lyric, You describe it as, quote, her somber multimedia mediation on Blackness and everyday racism, end quote. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how Rankine's work shifts attention to the relationship between white audiences and their gaze that is part of their racial experience. And I actually find that your turn to Rankine is actually related to one of the questions that you asked in your 2019 European Romantic Review provocation, where you ask us, how do we talk about Blackness without recentering white people or white privilege?
Yeah. Yeah, I asked that a couple of years ago. I'd still love to know the answer. I think, Rankine, I think, is the sort of the best example of that type of public-facing work that I was trying to discuss. Actually, she's the best example of really work that is simultaneously accessible, very challenging, very critical, is art, and is just doing a lot of things in a lot of registers, very, very, with great facility, and I admire that. I think, you suggested I read The White Card, her play, and I wish I had beforehand, but it's I think exactly what I hope to do, and I think Rankine is just so great and efficient at it, which is, as you say, turning the gaze, right, making us, and it's somewhat ironic, but really discussing and centering and privileging Black life and Blackness by turning our attention to both whiteness, the fact of whiteness, the projects in which it is complicit, and the means it takes to try to remain hidden. I think Rankine is probably doing a much better job answering that question about how to recenter Blackness as a analytic or as an object of study, as opposed to without privileging whiteness and privileging white thought about Black subjects. Yeah, I think, I also have to admit, I mean, there's an affective dimension here. I just like her stuff. I think she's really good, and this is true, I think, for art in my thinking in general. I think art objects, poems, installations, sometimes they just do something to me, and I think part of my job as a critic is to explain that, expand it. This piece by Ebony G. Patterson changed my life. Let's talk about it. So yeah, I think that's part of the, and we want to think about art as art as critical citation. I mean, that's how that happens. I think I'm sorry, I'm talking a bit too much, but I think my dissertation director once said, it's important to flag for yourself why you're doing what you're doing. Otherwise, go save the world some other way. And so for me, I like art, and I like art, and I care about racial justice. And so citation is a way for me to flag for myself why I'm trying to affect the world this way instead of another.
Yeah, I really love the way you pivot from art into these really great, what I perceive to be continental philosophical reflections. And this morning, I literally was listening to Patsy Cline like on loop, which was what was I was trying to get into the zone, and I was looking over my notes, and I was just thinking about what it's like to kind of, in some ways, depart from the obvious literary critical citations, and like think about the ways that you're turning to art kind of allows for a different sort of analytical intellectual space. And I thought a lot about what you call melancholic fictioning. But before I get into that question, with regards to your most recent essay, the Counting the Bodies, Ferguson and Ferguson, I didn't realize that Ebony G. Patterson, because when I looked up her image, the image that you of her installation, I didn't get a sense of its space, and I just wanted to share its kind of spatial appearance, or like, you know, just to get a sense that it's actually a spatial experience. It's not just the image that you describe in the article. And I'll also link to her other installation work. I'll provide again like a summary for what I see Counting the Bodies, Ferguson and Ferguson appears to be doing. So you turn to romantic counting and you argue that it can yield what you called imaginative responses to state power. That's on page 164. The Fergusons in your title refers to a scholar in the city, Francis Ferguson and Ferguson, Missouri. So in bridging Ferguson's 1992 book, Solitude and the Sublime, to Black Lives Matter uprisings, your essay traces how romantic poetry offers what you call a, quote, melancholic fictioning of life. That's on 165. And so through melancholic fictioning, you describe how there's a refusal to bureaucratic tabulations of life and death administered by US institutions. So I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about melancholic fictioning of life. I find it very productive in the sense that it gets me to think about avenues for avenues and artistic routes for lamenting and dealing with grief, and the kinds of things that have been amplified and brought into sharp relief, sharp focus during this particular moment. So could you say more about Alfredo? Is it Jar? I should have asked you this a while
I've
ago.
heard Yar, but I would defer to others.
And Ebony.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think Yar, in that article they started with Yar and Rankine, and I noticed that they were sort of an aesthetics of counting that to me was very melancholic and you know, of course attached to death and deathliness, and you know, Kristina Sharp and others have really talked recently about Black life living or operating through and in spite of the deathliness of Blackness. I think what I really wanted to emphasize with melancholy fictioning of life is the word fictioning more so than melancholy. I'm someone very intrigued by the sort of etymology of fictioning, you know, to shape, to figure, all of these conceptual links that the word fictioning takes us to. And I was also very interested in poesis and to think, you know, these classic distinctions that we make, fiction and poetry, both have their roots in imaginative construction and shaping and altering the world. I think for me, a melancholy shaped fictioning of life is a sort of art object that, let's say in the case of Patterson or Rankine, I mean, it's a way of talking about Black life without the exclusive focus on Black death. I think that's what is perhaps melancholic about it. But I really wanted to focus on the shaping and the creation and the construction of life, and for me that does really, you know, important critical work. Thank you for sending that image of the sort of spatial configuration of when they grow up in the chat. I like to say, you know, I entered that room back in June of 2015 and I never left, and it made me really think about it really forced a lot of connections to be made about religion and childhood and innocence and fragility and vulnerability and development and futurity. It really did all of that so quickly and efficiently. And so criticism can only ever aspire to that sort of efficiency. I think for me, it's not even art, but the aesthetic experience is the foreknowledge of criticism, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I was very struck by the pink of that
Yeah.
work. And it actually, I'm going to cite somebody who I've been thinking about her work quite a bit. Christine Goading Doty's work is really great, and she has an essay that is available for free. It's called Beyond the Pale Blog, Tumblr Pink and the Aesthetics of White Anxiety. And I think, you know, I'm a little bit, I shy away from theorizing around affect, but I find it increasingly useful, especially thinking about her work and your work together, of the ways in which we have to interrogate the affective appeal and draw of whiteness, and what Dylan Rodriguez calls white being. And so, yeah, so I am very grateful that I've never heard of Ebony Patterson before. And so I have a final question, or I don't know. Bakary, do you want to tell me what you would like to talk about in like the final minutes of this? I know. I'm exposing everything. I sent you the questions beforehand. So, exposing everything.
She broke the frame. You know, I think, I should just add, there's one more thing that I would like to say about the previous question on art. I recently was teaching Kristeva's psychoanalysis in the Polis, and she mentions style, and I would include in that aestheticization as a critical interpretation of the world, and so that's what I kind of, you know, hope to aspire towards, sort of how the process of craft or aesthetics can be its own critical investigation or interpretation. I'm, you know, I think we still have some time, but I'm happy to talk about perhaps you asked the question about, you know, why are you here? Perhaps happy to talk about that.
Yeah. Do you want to share how well, I'll share. So we talked about, frankly, the kind of cannibalization of theories from Black studies and ethnic studies. And the question that we both raised was, why are you here? And actually, as I was thinking about that in preparation for today's discussion, I think how are you here is also really important to ask, right? Like, why are you here and how are you here? I do want to drop some references to some texts that have been really important for helping me think about the institutional context for theories that come out of Black studies and ethnic studies departments, specifically Roderick Ferguson's work. Oh, sorry, I was going to say write an, yes, I want to write an essay with you. Oh my God, I'm so bad at Zoom. Okay, so I want to write an essay
Ferguson.
About Ferguson to Ferguson to Ferguson. Okay, so
coming soon.
That's not embarrassing for exposing everything. Okay, and then the other thing that I that I want people to read. Okay, let me see. I'm not going to drop anymore. Okay, that is the title. This is by Manning Maribel. Black Studies in the Racial Mountain. And I think this would be a very good, at least a starting point for thinking about the fights for spaces for studying race and ethnicity within the university, and the kinds of risks and, you know, people made a lot of sacrifices so that these theories could come through.
Mhm.
So I think that's all I wanted to say. I'm like totally like, I can't
It's
believe
okay.
I'm we're gonna write this essay now. We're gonna have to write it.
Well, now we have to.
Ferguson,
I
Ferguson.
yeah. Yeah. So I think I remember telling a story of going to a sort of reading group and getting the feeling that people who were at that reading group were really there to sort of punish Black studies and to discipline it in more than one way, right? To sort of undisciplining is the sort of buzzword, but to there were attempts to make it fit the sort of established frames of, let's say 18th century or Romanticism, as opposed to seeing how 18th century studies or Romantic studies would change and alter, would be altered by Black study and Black studies. So that was the sort of root of the question, why are you here? And to ask those people at that reading group, why are you here? And you're right. It's also the question of how you hear and the importance of the fact that so many people fought for the privilege we have to talk and think about the text that we do. For me, it pushes me to always remember that as a grad student or as an instructor, early career researcher, et cetera, to affirm presence, that people fought for you to be here, and so you deserve to be here. And so I love that question, why are you here? And we should always be posing it to ourselves to think about the affective, but also the ethical and political reasons why and how we do what we do.
And still fighting. People are still fighting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think you should have the last word. So, but I don't know. How much time do we have left?
Well, if we could, maybe this is time to invite our attendees. If you would pose your questions in the Q&A, we would appreciate that. And I want to thank you guys. I have a million of my own questions. So I'll ask 999. But to take up where you both just brought us, which was to affirm presence. And one of the things that is very powerful in the work that both of you do is really disentangling or challenging the field of kind of the long 18th century to disentangle Blackness from only signifying through chattel slavery and saltwater slavery. That obviously that is a defining structure. But I'm part of what I'm hearing too is kind of the spaces of art and the spaces of joy and the spaces of promise. And so my question is, it's almost, and I'm kind of leaning on Saidiya Hartman for this, because on the one hand, critical fabulation has in some ways a lot of resonances with melancholic fictioning of life, right? Mm-hmm. But what's different, and that, Venus and Two, that is doing absolutely monumental work. But the Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments is looking at the joy, right? Mm-hmm. So where is it and how is it that you in both of you kind of critically, in terms of your archive, in terms of the art and the possibilities that aesthetics makes available, where are you finding these sites of presence?
Well, I'll let you maybe start.
So you think I should start?
If you'd like.
I mean, I think I can start. I think that I think the why are you here and how are you here, those were the questions that led me to the sets of texts that I engage with in my work, and works that have made me wonder about why I don't know more about them. And you know, I think it was very like the Bakary, your point about like never really leaving that room, that art installment. I think that
Mhm.
that's precisely it, right? Like I think that that there are art pieces, there are footnotes that that you know come across, and you're just like, huh, why don't I know more about this person or these lives? And then once you find those texts or you find those historical figures, then you know it's both like I guess there's definitely hope and joy and presence. There's also like pain and struggle, a lot of kinds of realizations that one makes for why you don't know certain things and how you know certain other things. Like one of the things that you know I think a lot about is, you know, English departments are still structured by imperial historiography. And like and that my, you know, previous engagements with English literature was at least when I wanted to think about race through literature, and then by going into like thinking about periodization, I realized, you know, that well, this idea of race is like specific to the English. It's an English idea of race, right? And so there's all, and um, yeah, it just becomes I think the questions, why are you here? How are you here? Ultimately, it doesn't just transform the things that we write about or the things that we talk about. It also like it transforms you. And so I do believe that like creating space and thinking about scholarship beyond productivity, like thinking about spending time and thinking about
Mhm.
these texts, the ways that they can pique our curiosity and deal with both like both the joy and the presence, but also the kinds of you know there like there is pain there too. So and so to not shy away from it and to know that that pain comes from somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that, and I think that's a really useful um, methodological. I wouldn't say dictum, but something to think about, to question why we don't know more about a thing that we don't know more about, and that's a huge motivating factor. I think for me, you know, I also for me, I think there was a moment where I started watching, you know, like old, you know, videos of like 70s, 80s Soul Train, and it being so amazing because it was a sincere insistence on Black joy and Black beauty and all of these things, even amidst, in spite of, because of all of the turmoils of the present and the past and of the future as well. I think you know, we've all been taught, and I hope we continue to learn more and to think more about the facts of slavery and the facts of Black, you know, anti-Blackness and white supremacy, etc. But I also hope more of us can insist on the facts of joy, and not necessarily to put these two in opposition, but to you know, paint a better picture of the facts.
Thank you. So I wonder if kind of turning from that, I wonder if you, and I'm inspired still by, so everyone should read this. I have, anyway, everyone should read this, and I think everyone here knows, yeah, will. So one of the things that kind of to use McKendrick to get to thinking about the long 18th century and to think about the field of the long 18th century in kind of 18th century studies, straight up kind of asex stuff, Romanticism, Nasser, that we have these structures, these institutions that have been very inhospitable to anyone who isn't a cisgendered white man, and kind of in the scholarly productions that come through that. And it continues, and I am fighting hard. We're all fighting very hard for kind of the structural change that that is possible, that is right, kind of we're on the cusp of this, of sort of making these critical institutions intellectually more capacious, frankly. And so how is it that you imagine yourselves as scholars in relation, and Kristina, you're saying, English departments are kind of set up through the logics of British imperial history, just as all of the institutions that facilitate our work. So departments, the teaching, our paychecks, our publishing, our conferences. So how is it, in kind of how are you finding your ways through and against and with these institutions? And what would some of your advice be to your kind of colleagues coming up, your peers? And part of what I'm getting at is, what is the world that you want? What is the world that you want? And then of course the doer in me is, and how do we get there?
Well, I'd love to know an answer to that. I mean, the world I want is more just, more loving, etc. And how to do that, I think I control what's in my power. I think one thing would be to, of course, create lateral networks, networks that allow us to not, have connections that are not necessarily part of a total institution. So just having, being a romanticist and having, 18th centurists to talk to is a very small gesture, but a lot, but a big one, and broadening out, right, going into learning from Black studies or gender studies, and creating networks that way. I think that's one thing that I would like. It wouldn't necessarily dissolve the field, but at least it can help us think about new configurations. And we should be thinking about new configurations. I mean, the problems of periodization as it currently exists are manifold, but I do think there's valuable effort in trying to think about what an alternative would be. As you said, what is the world that you want? But I have to keep thinking about that.
So there are a couple of questions that have come in thinking about, and I think one of them gets to kind of what the 18th century is today, which is, and I think of someone like, the poet Jeffers. You have contemporary African-American or British Black writers and artists really using the materials of the long 18th century and creating art from them. And so, and I mentioned that, we haven't talked about this so much, but thinking about kind of the way that the long 18th century is still, I mean, in an indigenous way, it's still going on. But these other artists are kind of showing us how it is also still going on. So is there, and it's, Kristina, you added in the chat some kind of gestures to contemporary artists, but does this matter to you two, to either of you or to both of you, in thinking about kind of the artistic works produced today and how they then inform kind of, or shape how we can navigate archives that both reveal and disclose and kind of enfold histories that we can and cannot access?
feel
Well,
like
I mean, oh, go ahead, Kristina.
no, I was just gonna direct it to you first.
First.
So I like we're playing tennis here. Just
Uh, so I would say at the very least that you know, work that and you know, I leave the word work ambiguous as to what it refers to, but work that you know, reinterprets and remixes these archives. I think at the very least they're showing us that history is still the stuff that makes us in so many ways, and it might at least reveal the effects of that to a larger and different audience. And so I'm interested in artwork, of course, that shows us the legacy of the long 18th century. But I'm also interested in artwork that shows us the legacy of the medieval period. I'm interested in artwork that shows us how we got where we are, and I'm particularly partial to artworks that gesture to things we can do to address and redress and repair the things that have made us what we are. And so, yeah, I would, you know, swing it back to Kristina.
I think so. I think the maybe like using contemporary work in our well, I'll speak from you know my most recent research. I have an essay that's coming out in 18th century fiction around Imawinda, the libretto, and I'll just say very quickly because we're low on time, but that I've lived with that text for a very long time, since 2016, and I turned to that text because I didn't want students to just see Orinoco as like the representation, like in like a lit survey class of Blackness in history. And so I found that libretto, and what happened was I actually had to abandon a lot of, I still close read, but I had to abandon period specific work in order to theorize with that text. And so it brought me to actually to like a number of disciplines, specifically sound studies and performance studies. I mean, I ended up learning quite a bit about disciplines that I don't have formal training in. And so I think, you know, using contemporary art allows for both, there's an element of play and experimentation. And I think it gives us some breathing room, I think, from what can feel like restricted when you're just like when you're just working within literary criticism. So I think contemporary art allows for us to think about all the other ways in which we experience art. You know, it's not just yeah, I don't know, it puts you in your body and your mind in a different way. So I don't know if that answers your question, Tito.
Yeah, no, and I'm really struck by, I think I can't remember which one of these, I scribbled it down, but that the aesthetic experience is the foreknowledge of criticism. I think that was you, Bakary. Yeah. Yeah, that it's, you know, we're at the end of the day, we're in our, you know, kind of literature departments. So the last thing I wanted to, I know time is really, I'd like to sit for much longer, but the last thing I want to turn to is to get at this issue of the field a little bit differently, and Bakary, you sent me on to a wonderful journey learning about Eva Beatrice Dykes. Wow. So there's an interview with her online from 1977. So this is a woman who, and this gets to some of the other issues that we've been talking about in the series of knowledge production at HBCUs. And so she was, you know, depending how you kind of parse it, she was the first African-American woman to get a PhD in, it was English philology in 1920, though a colleague who works on comparative literature is saying, anyway, the data, whatever how we parse that out. But the beautiful thing is that there are a lot of these figures, scholarly figures, but they are not there. I mean, what you say so powerfully and aptly is that we have the legacies of Lovejoy, of say 18th century, of Maynard Mack, of kind of these figures. And I mean, I think so. It's another sort of archival project, which is to say how knowledge about these literatures, these texts that are hundreds of years old, that knowledge has been produced in a variety of sites. And so we as a field, in thinking about, I'm putting I'm on the executive board of ASEX hat on. So really thinking about, or hat or heavyweight, but thinking about kind of the field and practitioners in a much more expansive way, and a way that is much more reflective of I'll say the world that I want, right? So how do to what extent, I mean, you have this call that we need to read Dykes, and we need to, so her 1942 monograph, right? This is a weak way of saying this, but can you say more? Can you say more about this? This kind of call to a historiographical reckoning with the historicity of our own field, and what we privilege and what we completely forget.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I love Dykes, and I absolutely work in the sort of wake of her scholarship. It's sort of something Kristina said earlier. To not just acknowledge that why don't I know X, but to think about why don't I know more about X. And for me, I saw Dykes, I think, in just a footnote somewhere, and wondering, I've never heard of this 1942 book on the Negro in English Romantic thought, and it took me on my own kind of rabbit hole, and it's just amazing how much work she has already done for us. How much people will reach out and ask, oh, what should I put on my syllabus? Read Dykes. She's done this work for you in so many ways. And so it's just, I think part of the article was to suggest, in a weird way, we haven't gone far from Dykes, and maybe we should, in the sense of thinking of new analytic, or thinking of new questions to pose to Romanticism. But we also shouldn't go too far, because she's done such a huge work of compiling this archive for us. I said this to Kristina in one of our meetings. So many of my favorite books that have taught me so much about various literary fields don't have those fields in the title. I've learned so much about Romanticism from David Scott's Conscripts of Modernity. I've learned so much about the 18th century and Victorian period from some Simon Gikandi, Slave and the Culture of Taste, and Maps of Englishness. These texts are manifold, and they're out there. I learned so much about everything from Civil Winter. So there's so many different places to go when we reconfigure what it is that we're looking for. When we're not looking for the 18th century or the Enlightenment, but we're thinking about questions that procedurally bring us to different places and different sources of knowledge formation. I also think it was Sarah Ahmed who said, citation is a very successful reproductive technology. That's true, and I think there's a call, or an ethics perhaps, to try to change who we get to consider our producers of theoretical knowledge.
Kristina, do you have any thoughts about the field?
No, not really. Well, I mean, there's so many people. I can't make a statement about the field. But I will say, what you said in response to Bakary, yeah, I don't, I mean, I love studying the 18th century, but I also have found other periods to be very useful as well. I love the work of Michael Camille's Image on the Margins, because there was like a period I was like obsessed with like thinking about margins and architecture. Like, you know, this is when I was supposed to be writing my dissertation proposal. I was like, let me check this out. But it ended up informing a lot of my thinking today. And so I think, you know, this is thank you, Candace Chu, for talking about promiscuity when it comes to the questions that we're asking. Promiscuity in terms of experimenting with different texts, different citations, different fields, because I don't know, it really helps, at least for me, it helps refine the questions that I'm asking, which Bakary and I have talked a lot about. We are in the fields that we're in because there were like we had sets of questions that we had to ask. I tell my students that, you know, I went to graduate school to be a Miltonist, and I strayed very far away from that. But Milton's still very important to me. I can talk about Milton on a different day, but you know, I just wanted to say, you know, it's a journey and a lot of experimenting.
Oh my God. Okay. I want to talk for many more hours with, you know, a glass of wine and all of that. But so until we can be together, thank you so much for your rigor and thoughtfulness and care and good humor. Pope has that line. He liked it so much he used it several times. Good sense and good humor, and that the ease with which we were all able to go to a new Zoom room. But thank you very much, and thanks to everyone here. And this is just one step. We have many more steps together. So thank you guys.